First of all, I'd like to congratulate Unisa, including its council, the Senate, the SRC, the unions, for the bold step they've taken to establish the Thabo Mbeki African School on Public and International Affairs. And indeed, I must say also I'm very humbled that you've decided to attach my name to this important school. A college library at Dar es Salaam University has a number of doctoral theses and master's dissertations produced by Tanzanian scholars. And it's important to note that these are theses and dissertations presented at various universities in Tanzania, in South Africa, in China, in Germany, in the US, in UK, by Tanzanian scholars. And here are a few examples of these theses and dissertations. One is on early career academics' professional experiences within a neoliberal context, a case of the University of Dar es Salaam. Another one is about employability of higher education institution graduates, exploring the influence of entrepreneurship education and employability skills development program activities in Tanzania. Another is about perceptions of climate change, environmental variability, and the role of agricultural adaptation strategies by small-scale farmers in Africa. And yet another is a taxonomic study of selected aloe species of Tanzania and the associated indigenous knowledge. And yet another is an analysis of the factors in soil water management practices of smallholder farmers in a particular district of Tanzania. And then there's a modeling optimal control of a threatened prey-predator system, a case of the wildebeest lion-prey-predator relationship in the Serengeti ecosystem. And yet another is an assessment of concentrations of trace and toxic heavy metals in soil and vegetables grown in the vicinity of Manyoni uranium deposit, again in Tanzania. And yet another is a mathematical modeling and optional control of malaria. I've cited these doctoral theses and dissertations because over many years, a number of our educationists on the continent have expressed grave concern about what they said was a failure of our universities to produce new and relevant knowledge. For instance, in 2009, the Association of African Universities published the Abuja Declaration on Sustainable Development in Africa, the Role of Higher Education. And it acknowledged that the real challenges for sustainable development in Africa are the promotion of economic and industrial development, the eradication of poverty, the resolution of conflicts, and the optimum use of natural resources. And it said that the African higher education research agenda tends to focus on purely academic and scientific objectives in order to ensure publication in refereed journals with little regard to developmental needs because of the publish and perish syndrome. And it says most of the research works in Africa are rarely relevant to the search for continental solutions to health, education, water, climate change, energy, and food security, all of them being indices for sustainable development. And it says where research has been conducted in relevant areas, the findings have remained largely on the shelves and unavailable to those who need to take action or to implement the often useful recommendations. In 2011, the outstanding scholar Ghulam Muhammad Bai, former Secretary General of the Association of African Universities, former President of the International Association of Universities, and former Vice Chancellor of the University of Mauritius, he wrote that most faculty undertake research for personal gain, with the aim of publishing in international refereed journals for promotion purposes. The chosen topic is often not appropriate to national development. Most faculty do their research as individuals, and there is insufficient multidisciplinary research, which is essential for solving developmental problems. And much of the research is externally funded, and being determined by the funders, the topics may not be of direct relevance to national development. And he said research publication comprises another challenge. Most of the research results end up on university library shelves, in theses and dissertations or advanced research journals. They are thus not accessible to or understood by policymakers or communities. While respecting these comments by the Association of African Universities and indeed by Professor Mohamed Bai and others who have made similar observations, we must draw inspiration from the fact that nevertheless, as illustrated by the doctoral theses and master's dissertations produced by Tanzanian scholars, which I've just mentioned, new and relevant knowledge is indeed being produced by African scholars. However, it will be vitally important that our African School on Public and International Affairs, the TM School, takes seriously the critical remarks made by African scholars about scholarship on our continent to avoid the negative tendencies that have been identified. Yet another African scholar, the Emeritus Professor Eldred Turosimi Jones of the University of Sierra Leone, has pointed to one of the challenges facing our universities. Writing in 2004, he said that on graduation, in most parts of Africa, our students are faced with unemployment. This is a social problem that has already resulted in a growing class of dissident, disaffected citizens ripe for disruptive antisocial action. It is our business in our tertiary institutions to look into the causes of unemployment and see how we can counter them. It would seem obvious that in examining this matter, as suggested by Professor Jones, the TM School would be well advised to look at experience on this matter from elsewhere in the world. Immediately, I'm thinking of comments made 5 years ago, in 2015, relating to the well-known Duke University in the United States of America. These comments were made in an article by a US professional economist, Brian Williams, who had studied at Duke University. And this article was headed, "Elite Universities in the US are turning our kids into corporate stooges." And Mr. Williams wrote, "Duke is a business, as are all colleges, and everyone has a job. The professors cared more about their real job, publishing in academic journals, than teaching. The administrators were corporate types who spent most of their time fundraising. The students were taught, usually not very thoroughly, and mostly by an overburdened set of graduate students and part-time instructors. And attached to it all was a basketball industrial complex, a multi-million-dollar enterprise awkwardly selling itself as caring for the educational prospects of its athletes. It was a massive system built not around education, but status. And some university presidents are remarkably candid about how they have transformed their institutions to serve market imperatives. And Stephen Joel Trachtenberg, the former president of George Washington University, acknowledges that he worked to transform the school into a luxury brand. And he said, college is like vodka, he liked to explain. So the New York Times reported, vodka is by definition a flavorless beverage. It all tastes the same, but people will spend $30 for a bottle of absolute vodka because of the brand. The implication is that all higher education is the same. Some schools are just cooler than others. The 2008-2009 financial crisis confounded most neoliberal beliefs about how the world works. It should have provoked serious philosophical thought about our society's value system. And the university should be the philosophical thought center of society. But elite universities still largely initiate elite students into the corporate ruling class and themselves embody the competitiveness and preoccupation with status that vex larger society. we are letting our most talented students, who could be the next generation of thinkers, to be drawn into jobs where they devise new ways to separate workers from their salaries or to help millionaires to avoid paying taxes. We're allowing the big business of college to dominate the real purpose of education, which is to learn to question everything, not to make sure you are on time to your Bain Capital interview. As Professor Jones had said, we are indeed faced with the challenge to help answer the question, what should be done to avoid or minimize the problem of unemployed university graduates? But surely the TM school will have to avoid the consequence, so graphically described by Brian Williams, of turning its students into corporate stooges. I believe that in this context, the school should pay close attention to some particular observations made by Mr. Williams. And here I refer to his remarks where he says the university should be the philosophical thought center of society. That we're letting our most talented students, who could be the next generation of thinkers, to be drawn into jobs where they devise new ways to separate workers from their salaries or to help millionaires to avoid paying taxes. And where he says we're allowing the big business of college to dominate the real purpose of education, which is to learn to question everything. Professor Jones, whom we have cited, commented on these issues when he spoke on African universities, African academics and African universities in the 21st century, needs and responsibilities. And here is what he said, that our African societies have been more inclined to take for granted as most desirable models the thoughts as well as the artifacts of the dominant colonial culture. Artifacts indeed which we cannot now do without. Electricity, cars, telephones, television, Western music and literature, etc. We cannot adopt all of these, but will be only mimics if we do not adopt them fully conscious of our own history, of our culture, our traditions, our social institutions, and our arts. We must adopt a critical attitude both to what we have and what has been brought to us. This should be a guiding principle in the selection of what we teach and how we teach it. African writers, the creators of new literature, give us a useful lead into this area of critical thinking. Our aim in teaching should be to produce men and women who are both critical and creative. Our students should be encouraged to be thinkers and doers rather than accumulators of facts and received knowledge. This must be so if they are to be instruments of change, working towards the realization of a just and consequently a stable society. The Abuja Declaration of the Association of African Universities that we cited earlier says, among others, that the real challenges for sustainable development in Africa are the promotion of economic and industrial development, the eradication of poverty, the resolution of conflicts, and the optimum use of its natural resources. Though incomplete, this statement has gone some way towards identifying Africa's central challenges. Over the decades of independence, our continent has learned some lessons as it has grappled with the task successfully to respond to the challenges stated by the Association of African Universities and others, and other challenges that it did not list. One important lesson is and has been that for Africa to succeed, it requires especially quality leadership. And here I would like to mention quality political leadership and quality intellectual leadership. It therefore stands to reason that, as clearly stated by the Association of African Universities, the African University must play a strategic role in helping our continent successfully to respond to its major challenges by producing the men and women who will provide the required intellectual leadership. I'm convinced that the TM School must position itself as a home of excellence in this regard. And to respond to the challenges stated by Brian Williams, by Professor Durosimi Jones and others, the school must strive to serve as a philosophical thought center of society, to train the next generation of thinkers who would learn how to question everything in order to create new knowledge, men and women who would be critical and creative. It must produce thinkers and doers at various levels of learning rather than accumulators of facts and received knowledge. It must add to the number of scholars like the Tanzanian scholars who have produced the theses and dissertations that we mentioned. And it must ensure that the new knowledge does not, as the Association of African Universities says, remain largely on shelves and unavailable to those who need to take action or implement the often useful recommendations. I therefore wish the Unisa TM School success as it establishes itself as a center of excellence dedicated to the Pan-African task to produce some of the intellectual leadership which Africa needs. And thank you very much.